Hello, everyone, and I'd like to thank you for your attendance and your participation. And we have a very, very special guest today, and someone that I definitely feel as though that the broader audience should be aware of, and the organization that is represented here, which is Margins Pushing Boundaries. The president of Margins, Dr. Shevonne Henry. And let me first start by saying, is it okay that I call you Shevonne?
Yes.
Well, thank you. I'd like to start off by at least having you share a little bit about yourself, and then we can just start entering to some conversations and helping others understand a little bit more about Margins, what Margins does, and how they can get involved.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Charles, for inviting me to this webinar. Thank you also for joining the Margins movement and launching our movement in the US. I think this webinar is a fantastic opportunity to invite people from marginalized groups to share their views and to finally be heard, and to share their experiences of what marginalization is for them and how we can work as a collective to mitigate marginalization in our society. So Margins started off in March of 2022, and it was very much the outcome of my personal experience of marginalization. So I spent part of my life living under the apartheid system here in South Africa. I grew up in a working class township um, here in South Africa. And of course, being a person of color and being a woman deeply affected the way I saw myself and the way I saw the world, especially at a time that was characterized by profound injustice and oppression. So what I found was, as I moved through my life, and I made, vast improvements from where I had come from, I found that the experience of marginalization was internalized. So feelings of shame and inferiority very much influenced how I approached life and my relationships with society, even with myself. So I started to interrogate the processes of marginalization through my research in marginalized groups and also through my personal introspection as a marginalized person. And I came up with the Margins Self-Awareness Program. So in March of 2022, Margins was very much an informal online community offering these self-awareness programs, particularly for the marginalized, which are free. They're available on our website, and I will provide the details a bit later if you would like.
Yes.
And so it was a means to assist marginalized people to identify, first of all, with the experience of marginalization, acknowledge that it happened to them, and then how they can embark on this process to overcome it. Because it's, our tagline at Margins is, and you were very much a part of developing this tagline, is that we know our programs work because they worked for us. And you and I, coming from marginalized backgrounds, Charles, we understand this experience, and all of the people in Margins are marginalized people. So we don't just advocate for marginalization, or rather the mitigation of marginalization. We come from that environment. We had the life experience of that marginalization. And that's what makes our organization different, and it makes our approach different. We're not talking about us and them, it's us. It's just us. So I hope I've answered your question.
Very much so, and I appreciate you sharing that. And what I want the broader audience to understand is that uh, about those distinctions that you were calling attention to. For example, I've noticed and been following a lot of your posts as it relates to individuals having self awareness, but also, most importantly, having an understanding that uh, they have to realize or have self realization around their circumstances? What is it that's holding them in the position that they're in? Could you speak more about your experiences with individuals who have dealt with and have accomplished, or at least succeeded, in improving their lives as it relates to marginalization?
That's a really important question, Charles, and I think that should be the starting point of, people embarking on the process of escaping marginalization, is first identifying with the concept of marginalization and where it actually comes from. And there's a huge stigma attached to social exclusion. So in society, when you see the byproducts of social
Mhm.
exclusion, which is poverty, unemployment, homelessness, substance abuse, violence, crime, all of these things, our immediate knee-jerk reaction as a society is to blame the person that's struggling with this byproduct of social exclusion. People don't plan to be in this situation, and they don't choose to be in the situations that they are, but because of the oppressive systems, they find themselves in this marginalized context. So that's one part of the issue. The other part is that there is a denial around the concept of social exclusion. We have not been able to accept that the social ill of exclusion actually exists. So what we do is we blame the excluded person for their faults, for their failures, for their incapability to achieve or to extricate themselves from marginalization, without thinking about the context and the history and how we as a collective society have actually contributed to this situation of social exclusion. So what you find is there's a denial on the part of non-marginalized groups. They don't want to accept that they have benefited from an essentially oppressive system. That's the first part of the problem. So when we talk about marginalization, we want to also talk about the reverse of that argument, or the other side of that argument, which is, how did I find myself in this situation of privilege? And the answer is through oppressive systems that create inequality, right? And so
Yes.
the other part of that argument is, how did the marginalized person find themselves in the situation that they're in? And a lot of marginalized people are themselves in a state of denial. They don't want to accept that they're excluded, because in acknowledging their exclusion, they're almost also acknowledging the judgment that has been passed down to them, that they're stupid or lazy or incapable or any of those negative things. So, the first thing we're trying to do at Margin, and this is why self-awareness is so important, it's accepting that you live in this oppressive society that has put you in the position that you're in. And you may not have seen how you came to be in this situation, because marginalization is very much an intergenerational issue. So, I discussed my experience of having grown up under the system of apartheid. My grandparents lost their homes because of the Group Areas Act of 1960, and they lost absolutely everything, and they were moved into this township. So and it's a marginalization that spans two continents, because they escaped the colonial system in Britain, migrated to South Africa, where promises were made, about their emancipation, and then they went through further colonialism and then apartheid. So it's that whole history that spans centuries, really, of marginalization that impacts on our lives, and not just our material lives in terms of economic injustice, but our psychosocial lives, because this perception of inferiority, of incapability, persists in your mind long after you've taken yourself out of that marginalized situation. So a lot of marginalized people find that they move forward in terms of achievement or education or economic empowerment, but then they find themselves regressing because the mind has not been emancipated. So self-awareness is the process of actually acknowledging that social exclusion that has
Yeah.
extended for generations, um, and then embarking on the journey to actually overcome that exclusion, starting with the mind.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, I did want to ask one question that goes into, I'd say, a direction to where you have so many individuals who look at the marginalized as victims or playing the victim and do not see where they have made any contributions to the conditions of those individuals. So, in other words, there's a loss of empathy, or even being somewhat sympathetic to the conditions of an individual or individuals who have been marginalized. Well, for example, here in the US, one of the first conversations that you might often hear about when you hear about the term diversity, or you hear about the exclusions that take place, be it corporate or social, however it's outlined. And I say this to say, or the question would be more in line with, how does an individual who feels as though they have not played a part themselves in the marginalization of a group or a person, they may not feel as though they've had a part in that, but to some extent, what role would they be playing? Whether to be an individual to help resolve the issue, or to understand whether or not they are a benefactor. Is there some role that those individuals who do not feel as though they're marginalized, what role would they play, or how should they view themselves in this particular scenario?
So that's part of margin strategy, Charles. So our framework for margins, the concept behind margins is around addressing social exclusion by building social capital. And there's different layers to that. So through our self-help programs, we are building bonding social capital, which is addressing the internal state of marginalization. Because until we address that, we're not going to give people the space to empower themselves. They're going to continue to be marginalized, and they're going to think that they deserve that marginalization. And so, the marginalized play a role in their marginalization to an extent because they isolate themselves from society for a number of different reasons. It can be that feeling of inferiority, it can be fear of rejection. So there's a number of psychological processes that go into that self-exclusion. So we need to interrogate that, and we do that through bonding social capital. The second aspect is linking social capital. So we link up marginalized groups with other marginalized groups so they can share that collective experience, and they can address these feelings of rejection and fear and inferiority as a collective by building up these support systems. So if I may run through our programs very quickly,
Yes,
we
please.
have the self-awareness, 8 Steps to Self-Awareness program, which is a 16-week program that just addresses that internalization of marginalization. And then we have the Margins Self-Awareness Journal program, which is a 12-week program. And what we encourage people to do with the journaling is to record every day the experience of marginalization, because in order to get past a lifetime of marginalization, we have to become aware of the negative thought and behavior patterns that emanate from that marginalization. And journaling is, the way to do that, because you get into the habit of observing your thoughts and behaviors, interrogating why you actually do these things and how you can break out of that cycle. And we recently launched a Self-Awareness for Kids program, which is all about getting kids to become self-aware from an early age so they don't get into adolescence or adulthood and they have these entrenched negative thought and behavior patterns. When people have completed the Margins Self-Awareness program, they then have the option of becoming a self-awareness sponsor. And as I said, All margins offerings are free. We don't ask people to pay, nor do we ask people to provide any kind of monetized sponsorship if you do become a self-awareness sponsor. Self-awareness sponsor is about taking someone, another marginalized individual, under your wing and helping them through the programs. And then we ask people who have, or encourage rather, people who have completed the journaling program to start a journal circle where you can journal as a collective and share your experiences. So this is part of building our support system for marginalized groups, because as a fellow marginalized person, Charles, you would know that we lack access to that psychosocial support. We either don't have the resources or we're still in denial, and we need to be eased into that process. And getting into that with people that you are familiar with, that have shared your experiences, is a lot easier than sitting with a non-marginalized mental wellness practitioner, for example. So I digressed a little bit, but coming back to your question, how do we get the non-marginalized to actually participate in this process? And this is where bridging social capital comes from. So it's linking up the marginalized with the non-marginalized. And how do we do that? Through awareness. And it's getting past the threat, because I think this is a big problem. The non-marginalized feel threatened by the marginalized. And you find this, in all spheres of social existence. When a marginalized person moves into a non-marginalized neighborhood, people go, well, there goes the neighborhood, Why do we see each other in this threatening way? So the the awareness, the public awareness that we're trying to create around marginalization is reach out. I think many people in society are for social justice, but the way in which we're approaching it is not in a way that would actually address social exclusion in a tangible way. No, because our immediate reaction when we see poverty, for example, is to give charity, some kind of handout. Now, that's because we feel threatened by the marginalized. We wouldn't want to have a conversation with a homeless person, for example. But that support, that acknowledgement of this marginalized person can be more valuable to them than the change that you drop in their cup. It gives them a sense of dignity and humanity, and we don't want to open up the space for opportunities, So as non-marginalized groups, and especially in the activist and NGO space, we'd rather speak on behalf of the marginalized than actually open up the space for the marginalized to speak for themselves. That is genuine social exclusion. It's creating the opportunities not for you to empower or emancipate another person. It's for them to be given the space to empower themselves. That is genuine empowerment. So, and it's driven by this feeling of the marginalized are a threat. They're going to take away our economic opportunities. They're going to destroy our culture. They're going to cause for the degeneration of our society. All of these things. And so what happens when we have that fear and we feel that threatening kind of impression when we encounter the marginalized is we build up these barriers. We reinforce the existing boundaries of social exclusion. And that is why margins, tagline is margins push boundaries, because we're encouraging the marginalized to push the boundary of social exclusion to access more opportunities, rather than to allow that boundary to be constantly reinforced. And we get to a stage where we're in these hyper ghettos of total impoverishment, and now there's no means of escape. So we need to seek out the non-marginalized as partners in this fight against social exclusion. And we need to make them aware of the damage that they're doing by entrenching this marginalization. And the damage relates to all of us. Because, of course, right now there are billions of people around the world that are marginalized, that are in states of poverty and inequality. Now, you need to ask yourself the question, if you are in an island of privilege, in a sea of poverty, how are you going to sustain that? With all the challenges that we have in society, and we're an interdependent society, none of us are completely independent of each other. How is that going to impact you? Because you're going to find that marginalization right at your doorstep one of these days. And you could yourself find yourself in a situation of marginalization. And then you will need help from someone else. With this environment we live in of uncertainty, where you can face a financial crisis, you can have a natural disaster, you can face conflict, and there's so many conflicts happening in the world right now. We need to ask ourselves, can we afford for marginalization to continue? And the answer is we can't. We need to be able to build resilient societies, cohesive societies, so we can manage the social threats that are on the horizon.
That was absolutely spectacular. Thank you for laying that out, because that is one of the key elements I noticed in communications, where oftentimes individuals who have achieved certain elements of success in their lives um, lose sight of those that do not necessarily have the same level of achievements or accomplishments. And so that is very helpful to understand that there is a bridge that is being built and has been built through margins that can help bridge that gap. And I love the analogy that you used in regards to an island of privilege in a sea of poverty. I think you should trademark that. But
I think that actually belongs to Nelson Mandela.
okay, well,
We'll
we'll flag
trademark it
that.
to him.
We'll flag that and make sure that he gets that recognition, and making sure that others understand the importance of what you've just shared. But most importantly, I want to ask the question: how can individuals get involved with margins and to become a part of this movement, to really start driving change, and from a variety of areas? Because I want individuals to really understand that this doesn't necessarily, uh, it's not limited to just one or a few individuals or any particular group, but it really and truly does affect everyone in its entirety. And I just want to make sure that they know how to get in contact with margins, become a part of the margins movement, but also understand what tools are available to them.
Thank you for that question, Charles. And we need all the support we can get right now in order to address this massive war that we're fighting against marginalization. So I think to start off with, I'd like to define what social exclusion is for the people that are watching today. Social exclusion is the denial, and here we get the oppression, the systematic oppression. It's the denial of meaningful participation in social life, and that extends to social, political, economic, and cultural life. Now, we spoke about the social aspects, and so I would like to encourage the marginalized to use margins-free programs, and if they don't want to, still create your own support systems to address marginalization, because you need to build up that social capital in order to create a better life for yourself. For non-marginalized groups, I would encourage you to please acknowledge the marginalized. And like we discussed in previous conversations, Charles, it's not about big feats like protesting or signing a petition or donating huge amounts of money. It's actually just your behavior on a day-to-day basis. It's making eye contact with a service provider, for example. It's just acknowledging someone's existence by greeting them, um, just acknowledging their presence rather than ignoring and avoiding the marginalized, because that is how you are contributing to these barriers, of social exclusion. So it's just your daily behavior. It's removing that threat and fear towards the marginalized and making them feel like they are a part of your society, a valuable part of your society, and they have some worth in society. That's a huge thing. In
Yes.
terms of the economic aspect, and we just touched on diversity um, earlier in the conversation, but this is a massive problem. Social transformation all over the world is a massive problem. People don't have equal access to opportunity. Even when they do have access to opportunity, they're treated unequally in the workplace through pay gaps, through blocks to upward mobility, access to leadership and voice. And we're seeing this manifest in the worst ways possible. People not getting the support they need and resigning. We've seen this in the US, committing suicide, suffering from depression and anxiety because they're just isolated in their workplace. Um, we need to open up the economic space for genuine economic opportunity. This is a core factor of actually escaping marginalization. It's not the only one, but it certainly helps. To that economic empowerment gives people a sense of dignity, a sense of autonomy. So if people want to genuinely address this issue of exclusion, they need to provide opportunities rather than handouts. Handouts creates dependence, and it entrenches inequality. Opportunities create equality and social justice. In terms of the political space, we know that we're seeing an erosion of our democratic systems all over the world. Marginalized groups do not have voice, they do not have access to their leadership, and so we struggle to address all of these social ills that are arising. So, as a collective, both marginalized groups and non marginalized groups, we need to create the awareness of what it means to be a part of a democratic system, and how do we meaningfully participate in that democratic system so that we can address the social dysfunction and marginalization that is happening. Finally, in terms of cultural inclusion, Margins has introduced the self-expression clinics, and we use culture as a means for therapy and healing. So people who are unable to openly discuss their experience of marginalization can use art forms to do that. But added to that, we're seeing a lot of cultures disappear because of this monopolization of culture in society. And so we have a responsibility to preserve cultures because that diversity adds value to our society. So again, we encourage non-marginalized groups to invest in cultural preservation initiatives, to be more tolerant and accepting of other cultures, so that we can preserve these cultures and the value that they add to our society. So people can take action in any of these fields. They can visit our website, www.marginspushboundaries.com. Contact me personally at founder at marginspushboundaries.com. Our programs are there, our initiatives are there. People can join our movement by signing up for our mailing list and getting regular updates of how they can actually participate in the fight against marginalization.
That is excellent. And thank you so much for your time and your leadership, for dedication towards driving margins and making sure that margins push boundaries, and to continuing the challenge of ensuring that we're, one, informed about the marginalized, but even more important, to develop tools and solutions to help those who are in need and those who seek to provide true assistance and help for those who are in need. So thank you very much for your time, and thank everyone for listening. And we look forward to future conversations with you. Thank you so much, Shevonne, and good evening.
Good evening, and thank you, Charles, for pushing boundaries in the US.
Thank you.